The great ceremonial hall of Aurelian's citadel floated quietly above the silver clouds of Varelia, held in the air by ancient gravitic engines that hummed with a low, almost thoughtful vibration. From the outside, the citadel looked like a ring of luminous towers circling the sky itself, but inside its halls stretched wide and bright, filled with glass-like floors, hovering chandeliers, and the polite anxiety of several hundred military officers who were suddenly very aware of how they were standing. Today was not an ordinary diplomatic assembly. Today, Princess Yara had to choose a husband. The announcement had been sent across the Allied fleets weeks earlier, and it had caused a reaction ranging from excitement to mild panic. Officers from several systems had polished their uniforms, practiced heroic expressions in reflective armor panels, and rehearsed speeches that were supposed to sound brave, but had occasionally drifted into dramatic theater. At the far end of the hall, the throne balcony glowed softly with pale blue light. Behind its curved railing stood Princess Yara, watching the gathering below with patient interest. She looked almost human at first glance. Her face carried the calm symmetry of her people. Her dark hair fell smoothly over one shoulder, and her posture held the quiet confidence of someone raised among rulers. Only one feature revealed that she was not from Earth. Her ears were long and elegant, rising slightly along the sides of her head, like delicate blades of silver. Among the Varelians, it was said that long ears meant one listened more carefully to the universe. Today, unfortunately, the universe was extremely loud. Below the balcony, the assembled officers were attempting to appear dignified while simultaneously trying very hard to be noticed. One commander had somehow positioned himself in a beam of decorative light that made his metals sparkle dramatically whenever he moved. He had been adjusting his stance for 10 minutes to maintain the effect. Another officer had decided the best strategy was to speak loudly about his achievements to anyone standing nearby. "I once neutralized a plasma crawler with only a utility wrench," he was explaining to a very tired lieutenant. The lieutenant nodded politely. Princess Yara rested one hand on the balcony rail, observing the spectacle with quiet amusement. Beside her stood Chancellor Velerin, her chief advisor, who currently looked like a man attempting to remain calm while watching a slow-motion disaster unfold. "Your Highness," he murmured carefully, "perhaps the officers are simply enthusiastic." "Enthusiastic," Yara repeated softly. Down below, one particularly ambitious captain was demonstrating his sword technique to an audience that had not requested a demonstration. The glowing training blade sliced through the air with theatrical flourishes. The blade narrowly missed a decorative pillar. A guard coughed loudly. Yara pressed her lips together to hide a smile. The ceremony had been created centuries earlier, when alliances between species were fragile and symbolic marriages had helped unify fleets and civilizations. At the time, it had probably felt very meaningful. Now it felt like watching several hundred professionals forget how to behave normally. Across the hall, a group of human officers stood together in polished dark uniforms. Some spoke quietly. Others adjusted their collars or checked the alignment of their insignia in the reflective floor. One lieutenant whispered to another, "Do you think the princess prefers bold confidence?" The other whispered back, "Probably." Both immediately tried to look bold. Yara's eyes drifted slowly across the room, studying each face with calm attention. Confidence, pride, ambition, determination, and an alarming number of heroic smiles. But as she continued observing, something else caught her attention. At the very back of the hall, almost blending into the last row of officers, stood a single human soldier who appeared remarkably unconcerned about the entire event. Corporal Daniel Mason of the Human Expeditionary Corps had arrived early, found the nearest open space, and quietly remained there ever since. He stood with relaxed discipline, hands loosely behind his back, watching the ceremony with the mild curiosity of someone attending a long briefing. Unlike the others, he had not stepped forward. He had not introduced himself loudly. He had not attempted to reposition himself closer to the throne. In fact, if someone had asked him, he would probably have said he was just waiting for instructions. At that moment, one of the decorative grav lanterns near the back row began wobbling slightly on its pedestal, disturbed by the air currents of too many moving officers. It tilted further, then began to fall. Before it could hit the floor, Mason stepped forward without any visible urgency, caught the lantern gently, placed it back upright, and returned to his position. He did not look around to see if anyone noticed. He simply resumed standing. From the balcony above, Princess Yara watched the entire thing, her head tilted slightly. Most of the officers were working very hard to be impressive. This one seemed perfectly comfortable not being impressive at all. Below, Captain Roven was now explaining, very loudly, how he once wrestled a desert predator during a supply mission. Several nearby officers were pretending to listen. Yara glanced back at the quiet human standing in the rear. He appeared to be studying the architecture of the ceiling. For the first time that morning, the princess felt genuinely curious. And somewhere deep in the diplomatic archives of the Citadel, several future historians would later agree that this was the exact moment everything quietly began to change. The ceremony continued with the slow persistence of a diplomatic ritual that had existed far longer than the patience of the people currently participating in it. The officers below the balcony had now arranged themselves in something that was technically a formation, but increasingly resembled a competition. One after another, they were invited forward to present themselves. The first officer stepped into the center of the hall with the confident stride of someone who had rehearsed his entrance several times. His armor reflected the pale blue light of the floating chandeliers, and the small drones that hovered around the chamber quietly adjusted their angles to record the moment for the Royal Archives. "I am Commander Talvin of the 7th Orbital Fleet," he announced proudly. "Veteran of the Titan Rift conflict and holder of 14 commendations for bravery." He paused slightly to allow the commendations to feel impressive. Above him, Princess Yara listened politely. Her long ears tilted slightly as he continued speaking about tactical victories, strategic maneuvers, and the time he had personally piloted a damaged cruiser through an asteroid storm. It was a very heroic story. It was also the third asteroid story she had heard that morning. When the commander finished, several officers behind him nodded with admiration, though one of them quietly whispered to another, "That asteroid storm was mostly autopilot." "Shh." The next officer stepped forward immediately, clearly unwilling to allow the moment of attention to fade. "I am Captain Roven," he declared, the same man who had previously mentioned wrestling a desert predator. Yara leaned slightly on the balcony rail. This one might be entertaining. Roven spoke with dramatic confidence about the harsh conditions of frontier planets, the dangers of alien wildlife, and the importance of courage in extreme environments. At one point, he lifted his arm to demonstrate a scar that apparently proved his bravery. The scar was impressive. Unfortunately, it had been acquired during a kitchen accident involving a malfunctioning heating unit. This detail was not included in the speech. Behind him, a human lieutenant quietly whispered to his friend, "Is he telling the predator story again?" "Yes." "How many times has that been today?" "4?" The lieutenant nodded thoughtfully. That predator must be exhausted. Up on the balcony, Princess Yara covered a smile with one hand. Her advisor, Chancellor Velerin, stood beside her with the posture of a man trying very hard to remain neutral. "Your Highness," he said quietly, "traditionally the candidates attempt to demonstrate their strengths. Is storytelling considered a strength?" Yara asked. Velerin hesitated. "In moderation." Below them, Captain Roven had reached the dramatic conclusion of his tale and was now standing proudly in the center of the hall as if expecting applause. Instead, he received polite silence. He stepped aside. The next officer approached, and the next. Some spoke of exploration missions beyond the edge of mapped space. Others described battles against pirate fleets in distant sectors. One nervous lieutenant attempted to recite a prepared speech, but accidentally activated the translation device on his collar halfway through, causing his words to echo 3 times in 3 different languages. Even the hovering record drones paused briefly, as if confused. Through all of this, Princess Yara continued observing the room with patient attention. She was not only listening to what the officers said, she was watching what they did when they thought no one important was looking, how they reacted when another officer received attention, how they treated the guards and attendants who moved quietly through the hall, how they stood when the speeches ended. And again, her attention drifted to the back row. Corporal Mason remained exactly where he had been earlier. He had not moved closer. He had not spoken. He had not attempted to join any of the conversations that occasionally broke out among the officers.
At the moment, he was quietly watching a maintenance drone glide along the upper wall, repairing a faint crack in one of the light panels. The drone hummed softly as it worked. Mason tilted his head slightly as if appreciating the engineering. Princess Yara found herself curious again. Beside her, Velerin followed her gaze. "Ah," he said softly. The princess did not respond immediately. Down below, another officer finished his speech with a confident salute. The chamber returned to its quiet murmur. Yara finally spoke. "That one has said nothing." Velerin looked carefully toward the back row. "Yes." "He has not stepped forward." "No." "He does not appear nervous." Velerin studied Mason thoughtfully. "He appears patient." The princess rested both hands on the balcony rail, watching the quiet human soldier who seemed perfectly content to remain unnoticed while several hundred officers competed for the spotlight. After a moment, she asked a simple question. "Who is he?" Velerin consulted the floating data display beside him. Lines of information shimmered briefly across the air. Corporal Daniel Mason, Human Expeditionary Corps, Engineering Support Division, 3 frontier deployments, 2 commendations for emergency repairs under combat conditions. Yara raised an eyebrow slightly. "Engineering?" "Yes." She looked back at the hall. Below them, Captain Rovan had apparently begun telling the Predator story again to a new audience. Mason, still in the back row, was now examining a faint scratch on the floor panel, as if quietly wondering how the maintenance crew planned to fix it. Princess Yara's eyes narrowed with thoughtful curiosity. "He is the only one not trying to be seen." Velerin sighed very quietly. "Yes." The princess watched the silent soldier for another moment. Then, for reasons she had not yet fully explained even to herself, she smiled. The ceremony had now lasted long enough for several officers to quietly reconsider their life choices. The great hall of Aurelian Citadel still glowed with the calm elegance of Varelian architecture. Floating light orbs drifted lazily beneath the high ceiling. Transparent walkways curved like frozen waves above the floor, and the distant hum of the Citadel's gravity engines vibrated softly through the structure. Everything about the room suggested timeless dignity. Unfortunately, the assembled officers were beginning to look slightly less timeless and slightly more tired. Another candidate stepped forward to speak. He had chosen the strategy of standing extremely straight and projecting his voice with the confidence of someone addressing an entire fleet. "My name is Major Kelran of the 9th Expeditionary Armada. I have served 20 years protecting the frontier colonies from hostile incursions." He paused dramatically. The silence stretched. In the back row, Corporal Daniel Mason glanced briefly at the floating chandeliers, then at the decorative wall panels, then at the enormous doors of the hall as if quietly calculating the distance to the nearest exit. Major Kelran continued. "During the siege of Halver Station, I personally coordinated the evacuation of 4,000 civilians while piloting a damaged assault craft." A murmur of appreciation spread through the crowd. Yara listened carefully from the balcony above, her long ears angled slightly forward as she considered his words. It was certainly impressive. But she had begun to notice something about the stories. Each officer described bravery, each described danger, each described themselves, yet very few mentioned anyone else. Below, Major Kelron finished his speech with a firm salute and stepped aside. Several other officers immediately shifted position, trying subtly to stand closer to the center of the hall. One captain adjusted his jacket collar with such intensity that his sleeve communicator activated accidentally. A tiny holographic display flickered to life above his wrist. "Reminder," the device announced loudly, "practice confident smile." The captain immediately turned the device off. Several officers coughed. High above them, Princess Yara had to look away for a moment. Beside her, Chancellor Velerin whispered carefully, "Your Highness, the selection moment approaches." "I know." "The officers will expect a decisive choice." Yara's gaze drifted slowly across the hall. The candidates stood proudly in their polished uniforms. Metals gleamed under the crystal lights. Their posture suggested strength, ambition, readiness to lead. It was an impressive display, and yet her eyes returned once again to the very back of the room. Corporal Mason had now discovered a new subject of interest. A hovering maintenance drone had stopped beside a wall panel that appeared slightly misaligned. The small machine projected a beam of blue scanning light across the surface, humming quietly as it analyzed the structure. Mason watched it with the focused curiosity of someone who appreciated machinery.
He tilted his head slightly when the drone extended a tiny repair arm. Princess Yara leaned forward slightly on the balcony. "Engineering division," she murmured. Velerin nodded. "Yes." Meanwhile, near the center of the hall, Captain Roven had apparently concluded that silence in the room meant people wanted more of his stories. And that was when the desert predator leaped from behind the supply transport, he continued proudly. A nearby officer whispered, "Wasn't it hiding behind a rock last time?" Roven ignored him. "Fortunately," he continued, "I was prepared." At that exact moment, one of the floating light orbs above the hall flickered briefly. Its stabilizing field weakened just enough for the orb to drift slightly downward. Several officers noticed. No one moved, except Mason. Without hurry, he stepped forward, reached up, and gently nudged the orb back into alignment. The stabilizer field hummed as it corrected itself. The light returned to its normal position. Mason stepped back into the last row. No announcement, no dramatic gesture. Just quiet problem solving. Princess Yara watched the entire thing. Her expression changed slightly. Velerin followed her gaze again. "Oh," he said quietly. Yara's long ears angled forward. "He fixes things." "Yes." "He does not announce that he fixes things." "No." Below them, Captain Roven had now reached the part of his story where the predator apparently weighed twice as much as it had 5 minutes ago. The crowd listened with polite exhaustion. Princess Yara straightened slightly. "Prepare the hall." Velerin blinked. "Your Highness? It is time." The advisor hesitated only briefly before signaling the ceremonial attendants. Instantly, the floating lights brightened slightly, and the murmuring voices throughout the hall faded as officers realized the selection moment had arrived. The massive doors behind the throne balcony opened silently. Princess Yara began walking down the long staircase toward the assembly. The entire hall straightened. Every officer suddenly looked alert again. Uniforms were adjusted, postures sharpened, confident expressions returned with impressive speed. Even Captain Roven stopped mid-story. Only one person seemed surprised. At the back of the hall, Mason noticed the sudden silence and looked up just in time to see the princess descending the staircase directly toward the assembled officers. He straightened automatically. Princess Yara walked slowly along the line of candidates. The air in the hall felt almost electric. Officers held their breath as she passed. Captain Roven stood very confidently when she approached. She walked past him. Major Kelrin subtly shifted his shoulders to appear even more impressive. She passed him as well. The princess continued walking, further down the line, and further. Whispers began to ripple through the formation. Where was she going? Yara continued until she reached the final row. Then she stopped, directly in front of Corporal Daniel Mason. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Several hundred officers stared. Mason blinked once, then once more. Finally, he managed a perfectly respectful salute. "Your Highness." Princess Yara studied him with calm curiosity. "You are Corporal Daniel Mason." "Yes." "You have said nothing during the ceremony." Mason considered that. "Yes." "You did not step forward." "No." She tilted her head slightly. "Why?" Mason thought carefully for a moment. "Well," he said finally, "everyone else seemed very busy." A few officers nearby tried very hard not to laugh. Yara's lips curved slightly. "You did not attempt to impress me." Mason looked mildly confused. "I didn't realize that was required." Behind them, Chancellor Velerin closed his eyes briefly. The princess studied the quiet soldier one last time. Then she turned toward the assembly. Her voice carried clearly across the enormous hall. "I have made my choice." Silence fell. Princess Yara placed one hand gently on Mason's shoulder. "This one." For several seconds, the entire hall forgot how breathing worked. For several seconds after the princess spoke, The enormous ceremonial hall of Aurelian Citadel entered a state of silence so complete that even the hovering light orbs seemed unsure whether they should continue glowing. Hundreds of officers stared at the final row, at Corporal Daniel Mason, at the princess's hand resting calmly on his shoulder, at the advisors on the balcony who were now blinking in slow, confused disbelief. One of the hovering archive drones drifted slightly sideways as if trying to confirm it had recorded the correct moment. Captain Roven, still standing near the center of the hall, slowly lowered the confident, heroic pose he had been holding for several minutes. A colonel quietly whispered to the officer beside him, "Did she say, this one?" "Yes." "The quiet one?" "Yes." The colonel looked again toward the back row. "That one?" The other officer nodded. Meanwhile, Mason was experiencing a very unusual moment in his otherwise predictable military career. He had expected many things when he woke up that morning: inspection drills, a long ceremony, possibly a disappointing lunch. He had not expected to be selected by an alien princess as her husband. He stood very still, the way soldiers often do when something confusing happens, but moving suddenly might make it worse. Princess Yara watched him with quiet interest. He seemed calm, not panicked, not overly excited, mostly thoughtful. That was encouraging. Behind them, Chancellor Velerin hurried down the staircase from the balcony with the careful urgency of someone attempting to prevent diplomatic chaos. He arrived beside the princess and lowered his voice. "Your Highness, perhaps the selection process requires a brief clarification." Yara looked at him. "I was clear." "Yes," Velerin said cautiously, "but the court may require reassurance that the selection was deliberate." "It was." Velerin inhaled slowly. Around them, the officers were now whispering openly. One lieutenant leaned toward another. "I think we missed something important." "Yes." "Did he give a speech earlier?" "No." "Did he defeat a war beast?" "No." "Did he pilot a damaged cruiser through an asteroid storm?" "No." The lieutenant frowned. "Then what exactly did he do?" The second officer thought for a moment. "He caught a lantern." "Ah." That explanation did not help. Captain Roven stepped forward slightly, clearing his throat with the careful politeness of someone who had prepared extensively for victory and was now adjusting to a very unexpected outcome. "Your Highness," he said respectfully, "for the sake of understanding, may we ask why?" The hall quieted again. Princess Yara turned slowly to face the assembly. Her expression remained calm, but her long ears angled forward slightly, a subtle sign of focus among her people. "You all wish to be chosen," she said. Several officers nodded proudly. "You stood closer to the throne." More nodding. "You spoke loudly." A few uncomfortable coughs followed. "You described your victories." Captain Roven shifted slightly. Yara continued. "But one person did none of these things." Her hand rested again on Mason's shoulder. He waited. The hall remained silent. Velerin watched the room carefully. Some officers looked confused. Some looked thoughtful. Mason looked mildly concerned that he might be expected to say something. He raised one hand slightly. "Quick question." Every head turned toward him. "Yes?" Yara said. "Just to confirm," Mason said carefully, "this is the official selection?" "Yes." "Permanent?" "Yes." Mason nodded slowly. "All right." The officers stared. Captain Roven blinked. "That's it?" Mason shrugged slightly. "I assume there will be instructions." Princess Yara laughed softly. It was a quiet sound, but it echoed clearly through the enormous hall. The tension that had filled the room cracked slightly. Several officers exchanged glances. Velerin looked up toward the balcony as if silently asking the universe for patience. A nearby human lieutenant whispered again. "I think he just accepted marrying an alien princess like it's a new assignment." "Maybe it is." The princess turned once more toward the court. "This decision is final." Her voice carried across the chamber with calm authority. "He will stand beside me." Another long pause followed. Then, unexpectedly, one of the palace guards near the entrance spoke quietly to his partner. "I like this one." The other guard nodded. "Yes." Meanwhile, Mason leaned slightly toward the princess. "Second question." Yara looked at him. "Yes? Does the job come with training?" The princess smiled again. "Oh, Corporal Mason," she said, "there will be a great deal of training." Across the hall, several officers slowly realized that the quiet man in the back row had just become the most important person in the room, and somehow he still looked like someone who had simply shown up early for a meeting. The news traveled through Aurelian Citadel faster than a meteor through thin atmosphere. By the time Princess Yara and Corporal Mason left the ceremonial hall, 300 palace staff members already knew, half the royal guard had opinions about it, and at least 2 diplomatic delegations were urgently rewriting their briefing notes. Inside the palace corridors, floating courier drones zipped past one another, carrying encrypted messages to distant fleets. Royal historians activated recording archives. Somewhere in the communication tower, an officer stared at a blinking transmission console and muttered, "I'm not sure how to phrase this report." Meanwhile, Mason walked beside the princess through a long corridor of polished silver walls and wide windows that revealed the sky far below. He looked calm, which was surprising, considering that 20 minutes earlier, he had been standing quietly in the back of a room and now appeared to be engaged to an alien princess. Princess Yara walked with relaxed confidence, her long ears angled slightly back in quiet amusement. "So?" she said. "So?" Mason replied. They walked several more steps. Finally, Mason spoke again. "I feel like there may be procedures I should be aware of." Yara glanced at him. "Many? That seems reasonable." Ahead of them, the palace doors opened automatically, revealing a wide observation balcony overlooking the city of Aurelian. The alien capital stretched across the landscape below in shining towers, hovering transit lanes, and wide circular plazas filled with moving lights. Traffic glided silently through the sky in smooth lines of anti-gravity transports. Mason stopped briefly at the balcony edge. "That's impressive." "You've never seen the capital before?" Yara asked. "I was stationed on the outer defense platforms," Mason said. "Mostly maintenance work." He looked down again at the massive city. "Your people build large things." Yara smiled slightly. "We prefer to avoid running out of space." Behind them, Chancellor Velerin entered the balcony with the careful posture of a man who had already survived several hours of diplomatic confusion and expected more. "Your Highness," he said politely, "the Council has questions." "I expected that." "Many questions." "I still expected that." Velerin glanced at Mason. The human soldier stood calmly beside the balcony rail, observing the city like a visiting engineer studying a complex machine. The advisor studied him carefully. "You appear unusually calm, Corporal." Mason nodded. "Yes, most individuals in your situation might feel overwhelmed." Mason considered that. "Well," he said slowly, "I once repaired a power relay while a pirate cruiser was firing at the station." Velerin blinked. "And?" Mason shrugged. "That was louder." Yara laughed softly. The tension in the air loosened again. Velerin sighed quietly, though the corner of his mouth twitched slightly. "Very well," he said. "If you are both ready, the Royal Council will wish to speak with you." Mason raised a hand slightly. "Before we go in there," Yara looked at him. "Yes? Is the Council meeting more dangerous than pirate cruisers?" Velerin answered immediately. "Yes." Mason nodded thoughtfully. "Good to know." They entered the council chamber a few minutes later. The room was circular, surrounded by curved windows, showing the drifting clouds below the citadel. 12 councillors sat around a floating table of translucent crystal, each representing one of the major houses of Virelian society. Every one of them was currently staring at Mason, not with hostility, but with deep curiosity. One elderly councillor leaned forward slightly. "This is the one?" Yara nodded. "Yes." The councillor studied Mason carefully. The human stood with relaxed posture, hands loosely behind his back, observing the chamber without nervousness. Finally, the councillor spoke again. "You understand the responsibility of standing beside our future queen?" Mason thought for a moment. "I understand responsibility. In royal politics?" "No." Several councillors exchanged glances. One of them chuckled quietly. "That may actually help." Another councillor leaned back in his chair. "You are an engineer?" "Yes." "You repair systems?" "Yes." The councillor gestured slowly around the room. "Our civilization is a very large system." Mason followed the gesture. I noticed. And systems fail when people try to impress them instead of maintaining them properly. The council chamber fell silent again. Yara watched Mason carefully. After a moment, he said something very simple. Well, if something breaks, we fix it. Several counselors began laughing softly. Velerin looked at the princess. You see? He murmured. Yara's long ears tilted slightly with satisfaction. Yes, she saw. Across the galaxy, alliances were built with speeches, power, and careful negotiation. But sometimes the future of a civilization quietly changed because a quiet engineer in the back row noticed when things needed fixing. The following days inside Aurelian's citadel became a carefully balanced mixture of royal protocol, quiet confusion, and the slow realization among the palace staff that the future prince consort was not behaving the way anyone had expected. For one thing, Corporal Daniel Mason kept showing up early. On the first morning after the announcement, the palace guard at the eastern corridor nearly dropped his scanner when Mason arrived 2 hours before the scheduled orientation. You're early, the guard said. Yes. The briefing begins at 10th bell. Yes. The guard hesitated. So why are you here now? Mason looked around the corridor with calm interest. The walls were covered in softly glowing panels displaying star maps and diplomatic transmissions. Small service drones floated silently along the ceiling, performing routine maintenance. I like to understand the building before the meetings begin, Mason said. The guard stared for a moment, then nodded slowly. That actually sounds reasonable. Meanwhile, deep within the palace administrative wing, Chancellor Velerin was attempting to coordinate the training schedule for the newest member of the royal household. The list was long, extremely long. Diplomatic etiquette, interstellar law, royal history, Varelian cultural customs, security protocol, ceremonial posture, formal introductions, and something called advanced political patience, which apparently required sitting through extremely long meetings without looking like you wanted to leave. Velerin rubbed his forehead as he reviewed the schedule. Perhaps we should begin with the basics, one advisor suggested. Yes, Velerin said quietly. Across the palace, Princess Yara stood beside a wide window overlooking the floating gardens of the citadel. The gardens drifted slowly in carefully controlled gravitational fields, clusters of alien plants glowing softly beneath the morning sun. From this height, the capital city looked peaceful. But inside the palace, rumors were traveling at impressive speed. Some nobles were skeptical, some were curious, a few were cautiously impressed. The palace engineers, however, were already enthusiastic. That enthusiasm became clear when Mason entered the engineering deck later that morning. The room was filled with layered holographic displays showing energy flow diagrams, orbital defense grids, and the complex environmental systems that maintained the floating citadel. 3 engineers were arguing politely about a power fluctuation when Mason stepped inside. They stopped mid-sentence. You're the human, one of them said. Yes. The one the princess chose. Yes. The engineers exchanged quick glances. Then one of them pointed toward a console. You worked engineering support on frontier stations? Yes. Good. The engineer gestured toward a holographic schematic of the Citadel's gravity stabilizers. This thing has been misbehaving for 2 weeks. Mason stepped closer. The projection expanded as he approached, displaying layers of glowing data. He studied it quietly for several seconds. The engineers waited. Finally, he pointed at a narrow section of the diagram. Your secondary field regulators are compensating for a delayed signal. The engineers leaned closer. That shouldn't happen. Unless the sensor relay is recalibrating every cycle, Mason said. One engineer typed quickly. The display flickered. A moment later, the system stabilized. The room fell silent. Well, the engineer said slowly, that was simple. Mason shrugged. Sometimes systems just need someone to look at them. News of this traveled through the palace even faster than the marriage announcement. By afternoon, several palace technicians were quietly asking if the human engineer might visit their departments. Meanwhile, Mason was attending his first official etiquette lesson. The instructor stood tall and composed in the center of a quiet ceremonial room. You must bow precisely 3 degrees when greeting a senior diplomat, she explained. Mason attempted the bow. Not 12 degrees, the instructor said gently. Right. he adjusted. Not 1 degree. Right. Princess Yara watched from the side of the room, arms folded loosely, trying not to laugh. After several attempts, Mason straightened again. Question. Yes? If I bow incorrectly, does it start a diplomatic incident? The instructor considered this carefully. Sometimes. Good to know. Yara finally laughed. The instructor allowed herself a small smile. Later that evening, the two of them stood again on the balcony overlooking the glowing city. Traffic flowed through the sky in quiet lines of light. Massive orbital platforms shimmered far above the atmosphere. For a while, neither spoke. Then Yara asked softly, "Are you regretting your decision?" Mason looked out across the city. No. You seem unusually calm. He thought about that. I spent years fixing broken systems on the edge of explored space, he said. And this? He glanced at the palace towers rising behind them. This is just a larger system. Yara tilted her head slightly. And you believe you can fix it? Mason shook his head. No. He looked back toward the city lights. But I think I can help keep it running. Yara smiled quietly. Far above them, the stars of distant systems burned steadily in the dark. And somewhere among those stars, alliances, fleets, and civilizations were beginning to hear a surprising rumor. The quiet human engineer chosen by the Varelian princess might actually be exactly the person their empire needed. Several months after the selection ceremony, life inside Aurelian's citadel had settled into a rhythm that no historian had predicted, but everyone had slowly accepted. The floating capital still glowed beneath its protective orbital shields. Diplomatic vessels continued arriving from distant star systems. Council meetings still lasted far longer than anyone preferred. But one quiet change had spread through the palace like a calm current. The quiet human engineer had become part of the system. On the morning of the Planetary Council Summit, the main chamber buzzed with controlled activity. Delegations from allied fleets filled the long circular hall. The great holographic table in the center displayed rotating star maps, trade routes, and defensive formations that stretched across half the known galaxy. Princess Yara sat calmly at the head of the chamber. Her posture held the quiet authority of a future queen who had grown even more confident over the past months. Her long ears angled slightly forward as she listened to the discussion around the table. Across from her, admirals and diplomats debated the movement of pirate fleets along the outer frontier. One general spoke dramatically. If the raiders establish a base in the Helios corridor, they could threaten 3 major trade lanes. Another officer added, our fleets could intercept them, but it would stretch our patrol grid. The conversation grew louder. The holographic star map flickered as tactical projections appeared across the table. Amid the rising discussion, Mason sat quietly beside Yara. He still wore the simple uniform of the Expeditionary Corps, though a small royal insignia had been added to the collar. He watched the projection of the Helios corridor with thoughtful focus. The debate continued. Ships, fleets, strategies. After several minutes of increasingly complex tactical proposals, Mason raised one finger slightly. Question. The room paused. Several council members turned toward him with curious expressions. Yes? The admiral asked. Mason pointed at the projection. Why are we assuming the pirates want the trade lanes? The admiral frowned slightly. That is their usual objective. Yes, Mason said, but their ships are older models. The hologram zoomed slightly. They wouldn't survive long against patrol fleets if they attacked here. The room quieted. Yara watched him carefully. Mason continued calmly. If they're moving into that corridor, it might not be to raid traffic. He tapped another section of the map. It might be because this sector has abandoned relay stations. One counselor leaned forward. Refueling points. Yes, Mason said. Another officer added slowly. Meaning they're hiding. The room shifted. New tactical projections appeared. The conversation changed direction almost instantly. Yara smiled slightly. This had been happening more often. Mason rarely spoke in council meetings, but when he did, the entire room usually had to rethink something important. Across the table, Admiral Kareth leaned back in his chair. You see problems differently, Prince Mason. Mason shrugged. Engineering habit. Later that evening, the palace balcony overlooked a city alive with celebration lights. News of the successful pirate interception had spread quickly through the fleets. The council had followed Mason's suggestion, locating the hidden pirate base before it became a threat. Below the citadel, transports glided through the night sky like slow-moving constellations. Yara stood beside the railing, the cool evening air lifting strands of her dark hair. Mason joined her a moment later, carrying 2 small cups of warm Virelian tea. Apparently saving a few trade routes improves one's popularity, he said. Yara accepted the cup. You are becoming quite famous. That seems unlikely. Engineers rarely become famous, she admitted. Mason looked out across the city lights. That's fine. They stood quietly for a while. Far above them, distant ships crossed the stars as faint moving lights. Finally, Yara spoke again. When I chose you, the court believed I had made a mistake. Mason sipped his tea. That seems fair. They believed you were unremarkable. Also fair. She turned slightly toward him. But I saw something different. Mason glanced at her. What did you see? Yara thought for a moment. Stillness. He raised an eyebrow. Stillness? Yes. She looked out across the glowing city again. Everyone else was trying to be seen. Mason nodded. That usually makes people loud. You were not loud. No. You were simply present. He considered that quietly. Well, he said, someone has to stay calm while everyone else is talking. Yara laughed softly. The sound drifted into the night air. After a moment, she said something more serious. You changed the court. Mason looked confused. I did. Yes. She gestured gently toward the city below. You reminded them that strength does not need to announce itself. The distant lights of the capital reflected in her eyes. And you reminded me that patience can be more powerful than ambition. Mason leaned lightly against the balcony rail. That sounds complicated. It is. He thought about that for a moment. Then he said something simple. Good systems work best when people stop trying to control everything. Yara studied him with quiet amusement. You really do see the universe like an engineer. It helps. The wind moved softly across the balcony. Somewhere far above the citadel, orbital defense platforms rotated slowly through their patrol arcs. After a while, Yara asked the question she had been curious about since the day they met. When you stood in the back of the hall that day, why didn't you step forward? Mason thought carefully. I assumed the person making the decision would notice what mattered. Yara smiled. I did. Below them, the lights of Aurelian shimmered like a living galaxy across the surface of the planet. Across distant star systems, fleets moved through the dark, alliances strengthened, and civilizations continued their quiet progress through the vastness of space. And in the floating citadel above it all, the future queen and the quiet human she had chosen stood together, watching the stars. The loudest voices had once tried to win her attention, but in the end, the one who had simply waited had changed everything.